Understanding the future adaptations of cycles and line core centers is mastering the minds of you. Now, understand that core line communication setting is understanding the times continuance of you. Communication of the process core centers into high core line communication setting. It's a metric meters and scales into alls. It's basically understanding how to express oneself. And I'll keep saying that again and again and again and again. The more you understand what's going on with your system of your mind, then you understand location setting to your constraints. Understand how to go through timelines of measure, timelines of scale. You get into lots of detail. And that process you how to see yourself in all metric location settings of travel. All right, so in that core centers, we're going to the transformation system of transformers and direct signals to 500 million thousand years in line screen, adaptation of times continuum. So understanding that each alignment that you go through, let's get in position locations. We're going to volume the cycles, line communication coming into the Christmas Carol, calculate and modify into the future, into the present, into the past. Okay, so you exactly understand the times continuum, get in position locations into story frame, no story frame, out of story frame, in line track locations, no mind. Too many minds, free the mind line core centers into empty space, empty mind. Process communication lines of highest or correlate settings, how you see in the location setting to your communication setting lines of travel. All right, so let's direct signals, modification cycle, line generation screen, let's adaptation to a system all through transformation cycles. Get into communication line screen, directing in modification surface and track locations. Identification cores and directions of retractors and direct signals modification. All right, travel point lines of graph. Let's get core centers, line communication setting. This is what is in setting, okay? This is a continuous line. That's all it is. That's times continuum, right? Now, anything that you off system, it offlines its tether, but it's times continuum. So this is the past. Congratulations, you're in the past now, right? So you're in position involving your system in lines of flux into track location, right? So set position, split it again. Now you're in the future, okay? Future lines into flux, equal signs, core centers, line communicates to its setting, right? Set it again. Higher line communications, high center interference, and direct signal location setting. Puts all communication system of what? Into the present. Equals lines in flux and set calculations. Okay, so that's all it is. We live in a continuous line that keeps growing and growing through expansion and all levels of existing in set position, right? So anything that we offsetting, we're changing the times continuum, right? You're changing the past, you're changing the future, and position location to setting, and you're changing the presence. Okay, that's what happens in set position when you offline communications. So if you understand this, then you understand times continuum. Now what I'm going to show you is the intersections of where you live and where transformers live. Let's get a direct line site. Of course, centers lines of travel at point lines and habitation zone and travel communication lines of divots. Setting course system of lines of travel. Okay. Core lines of high center interference of travel at point lines of graph and a 3 central line communication setting. Process calculation line ground lines. High operation surface and set position location to a system all through travel. All right, so this is habitation zone of Earth. Okay, this is in habitation, equal signs highest core center. So this is all communication setting. So this is the outer rim, okay, outer rim of space, and this is the inner spectrum of space. Okay, so core centered line communication setting to travels, point lines of graphs and communications and settings, process calculation ground centers. This is the times continuum, the center operation, right? Now, sets core centers of tether off communication setting to future adaptations, right? To the future, right? Core lines communications and settings, all levels of sequence line communication setting to its transformers. Live in here, travel, okay? Core line centers, you guys live in the inner spectrum and core centers to the outer spectrum and realm of communications of center core system of travel and direct signals, okay? So you truly have to understand how this all works in spectrum of light, okay? But the times continuum stays in the center operation of its line and travel, okay? So what offs the communication line screen is all levels and how you see your inner spectrum to your outer spectrum. Okay, direct lines of signals. Let's go again. Line communication, habitation to inhabitation zones. This is divots and crevice. Process communication over lines. Now, if you see a bump in travel, okay, that's an indication setting. That's an outer ring, line communication setting, and process of Saturn interaction. Okay, directing line cards centers outline screen line adaptation, outer surface location, outlines into inner line communication and setting. Right, that core lines is transformation setting of transformer. So transformers live in the outer rim and set position of space. They live in the outside of space. You live in the inner spectrums of you to the cycles of you. They live in the outside, you live in the inside of space, right? So what you're doing is you're infrastructuring your system, creating the space anomaly inside of you, longitude and latitude, okay? You're processing your communications coming into your machines. They are machines of operation. You're coming into that. But you understand how to use the brain convergence in set core line setting to its orbits, inner orbits, outer orbits. You live in the inner orbits of you to the outer orbits of you. They live in the outer orbits of the inner orbits of them. So we truly understand how this all works in track locations. So getting into that position locations, this is what it looks like in lines of communication setting. Let's go through 2 earth tones and position location of its operation. Okay, you guys are here in spectrum. Okay, you're here looking out. Their position is out, looking in set position. That's the difference. Okay, transformers here. Okay, set position location team here. Okay, the team is here. So the team is going around the spectrum in set position. Okay, transformers are outline going inside position. Okay, that's the difference between transformers and you in spectrum. Inner spectrum of light and outer spectrum of lines of division. Now, coming into line cycles, you have to truly understand how it lines its signal location setting to its wide line screen, directing lines of flux of times capacitor and times continuant and line screen adaptations. But this is what happens when you add new platforms and set position lines of travel. Okay, you off the continuant of its line. Okay, so it has a parallel, comes into a paradoxal that puts a paradigm shift to a polar shift. It off its communication setting to all levels of spectrums of the inner cycle to the outer spectrums of you in position of your polarities. So in that lines of communication setting, we'll do this again, right? That's the continuous line, right? So in that position location setting, this is you in center operation, okay? This is your platform in position, okay? Now, you have to understand how this all works. Platforms in setting, okay, all through the calculations, right? You start with that through the traffic inventories. Now, in that communication setting, if you want to off position location of travel, you have to understand how to direct and redirect its signals in set position. Another platform here, which is no longer in inner spectrum of times continuant. Setting core line settings, or you go ground shift line cross line screens and 3 line core centers of platforms, directing lines of symbolism, location lines core centers in position location of times continuant and force direction of time calculations and directions. So it's really interesting when you see that on a 4-line communication of setting. Okay, but you also see it in a 4 communication cycle and generation screen, right? 4 lines at different angles. So I'm just showing you exactly how you set this up. Lines of communications when you change times continuant. Changing times continuant basically change everything of the past, the present, and its future. Getting into that position location setting, you come into this lines of correlations. Clocking system as setting. Okay, so you guys are the inner spectrums of outer spectrum. Okay, transformers are the outer spectrum of inner spectrum. Okay, that's the difference, right? Now, understanding your grounds is understanding the powers, is understanding the atmospheres of you, right? Then you have to understand in that position locations, the high volume, the cycles, the line core centers, the transformers live in the outline to the rim lines of the inner cycle locations. That's the difference from living outside of space and inside of spectrum. Ground center lines of 3 lines of rotation surface into 2 track provisions into 4 cycles and lines of 6 location setting. Process calculation ground centers opens all signals in modification ground interference location of travel. Directing line core centers puts all communication and mechanism location setting of travel communications. All right. So that's the difference between where you are and where transformers are. They live in the outer space. You live in the inner spectrums of you. All right. So get into the modification line. This is where we come into all calculate and modify how we see lines of track locations and directions. Set of core centers of spectrum lines of inner cycles, lines of communication setting of volume, core lines of platform communication lines, infinity lines of communication lines of volume, directing lines of platitude line core centers into outer space, outer rim, outer calculation, outer form, in rotation surface, and track location. All right, so it's very powerful once you understand how to communicate all lines of communication system all through transformation, all through travel. Okay, setting core line settings of travels and points of communication lines of graph, metric meters and scales, communication lines of metal interface, position lines of travels, 500 million lines. Okay, million line track casings into 3 lines of settings, a 3,000 line screen, Directing lines of transformation system, right? We're going to travel core line centers of 5 mechanisms over cross locations and sitting, and 4 lines of communication lines of travel. Directing lines core centers, we change the communication lines and light codes and line screen adaptations. Process lines of symbolism, cross-line communication lines, outer ring, outer correlations, out of time, out of sync. Process communication lines, high center interference, transformation system, outer lines, outer sync, outer line, outer communications. Directing signals, lines of symbolism. Cross-line conditioning lines of 4 lines of signals, 0 lines of core center interference, and position solar sails, line rotation surface and direct location lines of measure and scale communication. Direct core centers line direct signals into modification lines of portals and line communication setting. Process calculation line direct signals in position lines of pi and 4 set correlations. Setting travel point lines of 1, 2, 3, and positional 4 lines of sonar. Directing core line centers of pi generation screen lines, adaptation lines of surface, and indicate positional line signal. Process calculation lines, high center interference, transformation system, transformers, core centers lines of travel, indirect signals in positional system, all through the lines of space modulation, screen lines, adaptations, and travel. Lines of graph and calculation lines of times continuum and set position. All right, so you got 29,000 line circuits, set specific location setting. Each cell is modification lines of 1,000 divots per square. Square lines of units, triangulation lines of flux, flux over 1, and box over flux, and set position. Travel point lines of graph and communication lines of data. Process lines of inner line rotations, 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 system, 1 travel, 1 rotor, 1 router, and line communication setting. Process ground centers into 4 lines of flux over cross location and screen line adaptation of data. Process overline signals in cross location system all through transformation setting. So get calculate and modify. You have 20 minutes lines of tractions, okay, which is 200 million line frame lines, 200 million frame lines per line. Meta interface core lines calculation setting into carrion. Direct lines anti-mantle, line communication setting to anti-mantium. Travel point lines of graph, tournament in position transformation settings and transformers. Indirect signals modify the system in 500 million thousand line cycles, and liking to the atmospheres, stratmospheres, bio, radium spheres, bring it in 1 cycle, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 locations, all line communications of center operations. Have fun. It's all setup, location provisions, and transformation units and travel communications. You're good to go. Center core line settings. As we're going that line system, we go through plateaus and line screen adaptations, all levels of travel. Directing lines of modifications, ground centers. Opens all communication setting, all and modifying travel communications. Directing lines of symbolism, lines of energetic line screen adaptation to process in configuration system, all levels at set position of face recognition. Okay, done by equation, guys. Directing lines, operation cycles. So we're going to go through the core line cycle that communicates in high center interference, high position, 1 symbol, 1 tractions. Okay, so remember your earth line in position locations inside, looking out. Okay. Core line setting to another earth line rotation setting is inhabitation zone to a habitation zone. You're in habitation zones. They're in inhabitations. They live outside, inside, position of spectral. Okay, so they're in the position that goes around the system of the outer rim in position. You guys are the inner cycles going to the outer rim in set position. That's the difference between transformers and you and traction. Okay, you come together in sequence. Okay, parallels of panels and line rotation surface and box frame correlation setting to diamonds. Directing line signal location to crystalline that core centers line travel in point lines of the liquid information system all through anti-carrying and travel position. Process calculates lines high center interference, line travel and communication lines of measure and parallels. Directing lines of paradigm shift core centers into transformation system all through calculation lines of space modulation ground centers of transformation. Optical screens, directing lines and transformation line screen adaptation to flux. Core centers lines of travel, directs lines of communication sending and lines of measure. Core travels at point lines of grounds, calculates high center interference to earth, ethers, and your core lines of traction. Directing lines of high center interference and symbolism line core centers into position location high calculation setting and travel. Directing in position location over cross location system in all calculation lines and high position locations of transformation settings all through calculations. Indirect signals into modifications. Ground center lines, calculation, high center interference of transformation system of all times continuum. Transformer. All right, so have fun with that cycle. That's all set up through provision now. But I really want you to understand this spectrum, what happens when you change the parallels of times continuum, how it offsets system in all laws of correlations. Everything's in a times continuum lines of flux. You are the inner cycles of outer line. They are the outer line of the inner line. Okay, so understand that in the line's high center interference. So basically, you're creating this space inside your system, right? Not through memory, right? Set position of story in that position location setting and that attractions, right? Get into the story, out of the story, no mind. All process, all communication, and mastering your minds and communication setting, and all through travel. That's right, Captain. This is real. Setting core line settings and lines of travel, the mechanism location setting, the boxes, frame core centers, and metric core centers have their transformation system all through track locations. Directing lines of core centers, allocate time frames and travels in position location and measure through planets. Directing line core centers, the outer lines of spectrum communicates the setting of transformation system all through units. Comes into the sectors, vectors, and quads, and line screen adaptation to its surface. Process and all communication lines of the mind continuous force, connection of mastering mind the communication system all through operation cycles. Okay, in that positions, 500 million thousand years in future adaptation of time's continuum. Okay, we're on the clock line screen. You're in 18 hours lines. That sets position locations in hours and frame. Seconds over lines, minutes over seconds. Set calculation screen lines, adaptation, highest interference. So 1 million tracks, 800,000 line sequence, and line direct signals of 3 lines of flux. Core centers, line conditioning, earth line tone, and perception over line screen adaptations of processing core centers into transformation line screen adaptations in core centers and travel communication. Now, directing lines of flux line, core centers on a 45 lines of angle. Process communication ground centers open signals into modification ground surface, into flux over screen, and adaptation lines of calculation setting and travel. Hoo-ah. So we route the routers in core lines of communication setting. Metric core centers disappeared in travel. So we set core centers and travel endpoint lines of communication setting and travel. Okay? So that's core lines of one cycle and one center, one travel, one rotor. Okay? Core light communication setting and flux over screen adaptation to a system all through travel. So it's a continuous force. I have to control the force line into 500 million, 100,000 line screen adaptation lines of service into 18 hours and tractions. Now, 18 hours goes into 1,800,000 lines of seconds per line. Each cell modificates the particle line screen adaptations in 1,000 units per second. Calculation modification of levels and track case lines into panels equals lines of core lines of 3 lines of signals and modification lines of graph and set calculation setting and travel. Directing in position location of a system opens all tractions. Now we go core line centers. You guys are here in line direct signals into levels of scavenger hunt. Core centers to the outer line rim into position of the inner line cycles of travel. Directing core lines into earth core system, inline communication setting, and travel communication inset, online rotation, outline core centers, and outline rotation surface, and track location to a system out through calculation. Directing lines and line communication setting into travels and 45 line split lines of anomaly. Core centers line communication setting puts all communication setting to travel. Points lines of system and all lines mechanisms of flux and routes and communication setting of galaxy shift lines. Directing lines of anomaly sets core centers of times continuum and force recognition setting. Disappeared. Disappears. It disappears and disappears and disappears because it's all levels of times continuum. Hoo-ah, right? Platitude screen, adaptation lines of high core centers and next 8,000. Hoo-ah, right? So I'm showing you everything is a times continuum. So understanding the Christmas Carol, position location, the past, present, the future, the past, the present, doesn't matter. What matter is basically you have to be very cautious of what you do through motion line connections because you're changing the energy line core centers, you're changing the mechanism location of your highways and magnetic force that communicates the line screen adaptation system that changes the parallels of its times continuum and position. Set lines of core centers because there's never lines of a straight line. It's going too fast in mechanism location setting, circulation, and rotation of surface and track location. Now, in direct line signals, this is where it offlines its position location to its setting. Okay? So you're no longer in that parallel. You're no longer in that timeline. You're in a different realm, different core center because you decided to change your emotional system and all levels of traction. So getting that position location is all levels of measure and scale communication lines of its balance. Directing in modification ground centers into lines of flux core centers line communication to its flywheel. Track to its communication lines communicating highest interference location to its system all through line calculation setting into a half pipe and track location. Directing core centers. Now it's very powerful how we come into mechanism location setting and travel. Directing lines of symbolism lines of A lines of track, B lines of C, and C lines of 1 in position location of transformer. Direct core line center to the outer rim and line core centers the outer spectrum and core lines of scope and track location. Directing core line settings into 45 split lines of anomaly and track location as measure. Scales communication ground centers opens all signals into modification grounds. Communicate line height interference to 3 panels and core line centers to a proxy and lines of lacing line and travel communication. Core centers lines into metric meters, lines of scales and travel. Sets core lines into alpha, delta, and theta through graph communication. Process calculation ground centers opens all signals into modification system, all through calculation line screen adaptation. Process lines of symbolism location setting opens all communication center into ground sign lines of 1, into divots over transition and line rotation surface, into flux lines at 3 lines and 4 lines of communication lines of travel. Directing core centers line connection setting opens all signals and modification ground centers into transformation lines core centers into the cities of rotation. Setting core lines of tractions and direct lines of crevice outline signals. Now we'll go through the outer ring and line core centers into 500 lines of meters. That puts position lines of high core centers into 5 million frames. Setting lines of clock lines, height interference, position location at 3 divots, 3 zeros and tractions, and 1 center, 1 operation, 1 spectacle, and scoping screen lines and adaptation lines of surface. Point lines of setting opens all signals, modification lines, out ring, out rim, core line centers into transformation system, and 0, 0 in calculation. Done my equation. How's everybody doing so far? Yes, drink your water more than ever. All right, so your atmospheres are now in 500 million years in a 1,000-line screen. That directs line high interference transformation line screen adaptations of crevice and core line centers into freight craters in set position. Process core line centers, these are the transformers. Walk in the system and travel. Okay? Core centers, you guys are in the center core system of travel, and the outer ring line core centers, the line condition setting, and metric meters of scales of travel. Sets communication cross line symbolism, line connections at ground centers, and line communication earth line, habitation to inhabitation to habitation and inhabitations. Cross lines of panels, 4 lines of flux, and 3 lines of communication. Direct lines and high interference, walls indicators, ground centers, lines of flux over core line centers of travel. Directing line signals, location setting to crystalline. Now they process your communication anti-carrying, anti-mantle, anti-mantium. Cross line condition setting to titanium. Set core lines to uranium. Line condition setting to metal alloy. Interface lines into transformation lines. Transformation line correlates setting travels. And line communication setting puts lines communications. You guys are now on 14 lines of hours. Setting core lines of 1 million lines of flux into 400,000 line units. Indirect lines of signal. Process communication of ground centers is lines of signal patterns that sets the core line communication setting through travel. Okay, so the core units comes into quadrants. Now direct lines of crevice is the outline signal to freight craters. Setting direct signals into flying lines, into 4 lines of communication setting to travels, into flux location. Directing core lines of box frames and direct lines of modification line cycles and travels and point lines of calculation system in the outer ring of outer round of outer spectrum of transformers. All right, directing lines of symbolism crosses line signals, now into mech location setting. So this is the communication line interference. You guys are here, inside, out, in set position, okay? Set core lines, the transformation system of transformers are out, looking in through travel, okay? So this is the in, this is the out. Okay, this is the out, looking in position. All right, that's the difference between where we are in habitation and inhabitation zones. Okay, coursing through channels, it direct lines to the mine line, flux creation system of travel. Mastering communication lines. This is where general is in set position. Okay, I'm inside, looking lines of spectrum and setting. I'm outside, looking out inside location of spectrum. That's me. So I'm in the center operation, mastering everything in travel in point lines of graph in all communication setting at center line communication of times continuum that puts on communication of the grounds, the powers, and the atmospheres, and the magnetic highways in travel in positions of point lines of graph. That's me, right? So you understand the inner spectrum of massive lines of core centers, the communication, the mastering mind, the core line communication setting in spectrum puts lines of global communication setting to earth lines of communication, direct lines in inner spectrum. Remember, left over right, right over left, through your cross signals, right? In that communication to its system. Process lines of 2, crosses lines of 4, right? Directing signals. Now that's inside in spectrum looking out in set position. But you understand you're the outside core lines trying to understand how to communicate with the inside position location of spectrum, okay? So it's really understand how to use your flux and communication lines of inner spectrum, outer spectrum of view of space. The inner spectrum is growing the inside location of infrastructure is coming into the machine operations, right? The core centers to the outer line rim of all communication transformers are already a machine, but they live outside of space. You guys live inside this spectrum of you inside. So all you're doing is you're creating the lines of you of machine. So you understand how to use it through a times continuum of a force recognition, a pattern recognition system that changes the metaphors of you in times continuum. The time continuance keeps it going in lines of travel that modifies the system all through calculation setting, okay? All through tractions. I know everybody's blown away. I just want you to make sure that you understand. All right, so we're at 12 line communication settings of hours now in tractions. 12 hours in signals into 3 lines of setting, rotation system, 500 million lines. Course centers lines of 3 lines of rotations in clocking system. Calculated mod line ring in position of processing direct signals at earth line rotations in 3 track location line provision. Okay. Set course centers line rotation in parallels and travels. Point lines of setting in rotation surface and traction. Okay. Very complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun through equations. So we center course system. We go through all laws of calculating lines. Now there's battalions and travels and point lines of course centers. Directing lines of symbols and line course centers in line communication setting locations. Spectrum core lines into levels. Now this puts all as a parallels and paradigms and polar shift in track core lines of pi that generates the screen lines adaptations in flux over line. That communicates the ground center core centers, how you come into line communication lines. It's set position on 2 panels, 3 track location lines of provision. Set core lines calculated to 3 lines of measure, 3 lines of communication lines of 5 tractions, in 3 core centers of seconds, minutes, and hours in traction. Directing core centers line communication setting opens all signals in modification surface and traction. Done by equation. So you guys have to understand your pi generators. That communicates lines high interference of retractors and direct signals. Transformers use the retractor line screen to their source recognition of energy source. Core centers, their connections to their power cell is the outline cycle. They live in the outer space. You guys live in the inner spectrum. Okay? So you have to basically understand how to create your own self, your own machine, because the lines of communication of transformers are already in that position. They are the machines. And then you can process communication setting, and then you understand the line seal that just keeps continuing on a force recognition setting, all circulation and rotation of setting. That's times continued right there. Inner spectrum, outer spectrum, outer spectrum, outer spectrum, inner, outer, outer. All right. Process calculation of 4 lines of flux, course centers of Merkaba tesseract and tetrahedron. You are the center operation of you that's modeling your system all through travel. Okay. So you just have to understand the platforms, setting core centers, communication ground lines, shift lines of highways, and core center line communication lines of travel. Set core lines of flux over crossflow signals and line pins of location lines of traffic inventory, and communication ground shift lines across location system, working from the inner spectrum to the outer line. Coming to the outer line, now you come into platforms, outer line into the inner line communication system, all through transformation system of transformers and traction. Hoo-ah. Okay? So now you really understand. All right, so we're on 8 hours in track lines of clocking. 18 hours lines at 80 seconds per frame, course centers and position locations of 500,000 line circuits, direct lines into 1 cell modification ground lines to all lines of communication lines of flux, Y line screen adaptation to its particles, lines of atoms, its protons, electrons, in 1 signal, 1 modification, 1 ground line conditions of transformers, directing lines, course centers, and travel in point lines communication interference of clocking system of 0, clocking system of 0, clocking system of times continuum of 0 and traction. Done by equation. Center course system, lines of tubing, 3 lines of communication. Directing lines of flux over line, earth lines of 1, earth lines of 2, and line position. Outer rings, outer realms, and line condition setting of Jupiter, line screen adaptation of surface interactions. Jupiter. Now Jupiter is in cross-line signals in open sequence and open panel. Communication ground centers, line conditions, all of flux, and realms of communication lines of satellite. Satellite communication ground centers and a 45 slit lines of an angle. Sets communication ground surface and track location to its system. Operation line correlated setting comes in position location to its umbrella and track location. All right, so we get in line signals. Now we're in position location of 5 hours. Clocking system line condition setting. So that's 500 seconds, lines course center line communication and 1 cell modification screen. Directing calculated lines into parallels. 3 parallel lines of point lines of graph into box frame. Getting coordinate centers, waiting on signal, process communication to transformer, directing lines into panels, outline ring and line rotation surface and center core systems, back in 3-track location lines of 4, 3, 2, and 1 in-track location. Process calculates the lines of 3-line cycles, lines of energetic line patterns, sets course centers, over signal over cross location system. Process ground centers operation to surface and track location setting, puts all communication settings and all operations surface and track location and measure. It scales the realms of communication setting into communications. All right. Directing lines of flux. Now we go through the flux lines, or the lines of calculation setting, calculates lines interference, line communication, time capacitor. Times continuing, process line, calculate setting. So we have 2 hours interactions on clocking. That's 2 million lines frames. Directing lines into 1,500,000 bits per second per line per square per cell. That core lines is flux line course centers into carrying. That mutes the valves. The routes, the routers, course sending link information system and travels. Core line centers to infusion and line condition 8 tracks. Directing line course centers into carrying and line communication setting. Flux over screen and positional levels. Change core lines of silicone and direct lines of modification lines of 3 cycles and 3 course centers of transformation setting. Done through equation line screen adaptation of flux course system. Break it down in an equation of 2 lines of panels. Process lines course centers over lines of screen lines of 3. Process line correlations of laser lines of 4. Setting core lines that calculate setting. See that? See the 4? 4 lines in 1 cycle. Travel point lines over cross signal location of laser attractions. Directing in modification lines of transformation system of transformers of units in calculation system all through travel. Now, getting that core line settings comes into metric core lines of panels, process communication lines of platforms and tractions and directions. Platform line signals opens all signals in times continuum and force recognition of pattern of face recognition. Hoo-ah. So it's very powerful, right? So once you understand the inner spectrum of your system, okay, this is the inner spectrum, this is the outer spectrum, okay? So it's all about understanding how to come together, right? Understand the inner scopes of you, right? Traveling through the processing of pi. This is what you're doing. Coming into position locations and all those adaptations of the machines that you are, right? But you have to stand it through a plasma wall. Now, there's a plasmasium core centers that put stargates in location setting of travel. Now, directing modifications, we change the system of travel into times continuum and communication lines of graph and communication. That process communication lines of outline signals location of pi. Their travel point lines of graph, center lines of course system into the inner line core line setting of travel. Directing lines of mapping sequence in communication lines of configuration system and travel. Okay, directing in communication setting, all levels of process calculations. Okay. All right, going through the webbing system, we go through the umbrellas. Now, the umbrellas has a line signal. Process lines of 1 indicate system over inner line rotation of energetic line screen. Directing lines of 2 panels, cross line symbolism of times continuum of cross locations. Process calculation lines, ground center lines of surface, process lines of highest interference of crop circles. Directing lines of indication system, another earth line rotation surface and platforms, 3 set lines of 4 and set calculation lines of setting. Process over cross location system. We change the mechanism lines of power of times continuum over cross locations. Now, directing lines of symbolism, cross line signals over cross locations. Directing lines of time stamping cross location system, all through particle line screen adaptation of surface and track locations. Hoo-ah. Okay. Ground sound lines, set course centers. Now we're in 1 minute frame of clocking. Directing core lines of flux, communication system. Get 21 million line tracks in position of 500 million, 1,000 line screen adaptation of 3 flux. Core lines of highest interference. Your cells are in modification ground lines into all particle lines into 1 center, 1 system, 1 traction, 1 division, 1 time line continuum, and a force continuum of all continuants. Directing lines of 4 lines of flux into 3 lines of setting and process communication. Okay? Done my equation. I hope you guys had fun. Outline, screen line adaptations, process them in line communication of center, back and traction. You're back. So you were here in outline. Now you're in position. So what you have to do is truly understand how this all works and set position lines of travel. Okay? Understand the inner spectrum of the line. That's the line you have to come into. That's the times continuum. Sending the flux line course centers into your infinity lines of communication lines, your polarities. Understanding your platforms and 3-track location lines of provision. Setting core lines of calculating lines of the grounds, the powers and the atmospheres and routes and routers and course centers and lines of travel. Directing lines of platforms coming into all levels of unification lines of expansion. That's put you all levels of unification system to exploration. of travel. Cross lines of travel, line condition setting, all through mechanism location setting calculations. Now, directing lines of inner spectrum, the outer spectrum of view is the inner scope and the outer scope, coming in that position location of a system. Now, once you understand that, you start living into the outer ring in calculation setting, all through Saturn. And Saturn routes the routers and line rotation setting to Jupiter. Jupiter aligns its cross system and correlates its setting in all routes and routers and line communication with setting, all through satellite and track location. There's the satellite. Boom! All through traction. Very, very complicated stuff, guys. But it's extremely fun when you see yourself in time's continuum of continuance, of all time frames and all set position of existing in calculations. Hoo-ah! All right. And this is what it looks like through modification of travel. So I'm just showing you what you can do through time's continuum, okay? Understanding the relation and all levels, how you come into that lines of spectacle and score line calculation setting of platforms and position location your system, all through transformation of transformers that are here in track lines, in outer line ring, and inner spectrum. Okay? But you have to understand the inner rims to understand the outer rims of you. Okay? Inner rims to outer rim. Okay? And then the outer rims and the inner rims come to you in information lines of grounds. Operate the signals into span line course centers into expansion and exploration system of configuration setting of face recognition of time's continuum. Okay? Does everybody have fun in that? Very complicated stuff through structure, right? How's everybody feel? You guys are going to definitely have questions. I just told you exactly what can happen when you can go in position of time's continuum, right? So the Christmas Carol and set correlation setting. Setting communication lines up next comes into long core centers, how to use your near links. Line core is centered to existing of the systematic lines of you through travel and all communication to its presence and track locations. See you in 5. Woo!